Great. So welcome everybody. How we're going to do this session today is I will start by giving a brief overview of what we mean by stress, and then I will be handing over to Yet and to Laura, who will then talk about physical activity and how we can use physical activity to cope with stress. So stress is quite an interesting topic in terms of, I think we would all identify that we experience stress, but how we explain what stress is, how we can describe stress might differ for different people. And it's one of those terms that we use a lot in society, but actually what it is can be quite difficult to unpick. And so to get started with this webinar, I actually asked AI to generate me a picture of stress. And it gave me two pictures. And these are the two that it generated. And so what this would tell me is that stress quite clearly is a head in hands moment. But also according to AI, stress also seems to be something we experience when we're at our desk or surrounded by a bunch of papers and a lot of other people. Now, for some of you listening, you may be thinking that's exactly what stress is like for me. But for others of you, that may not be stress at all. And stress might not be that, hopefully not that head in hands moment or in the workplace. So stress is much more broad than this, but this is typically perhaps what people tend to think of when we think of stress. There isn't really a clear description. Researchers don't really agree, and how different charities and organizations describe stress can often differ as well. And these are just a few of the broader descriptions that we can see in terms of what we mean by stress. So you can see here that stress is the body's response to a challenging or a demanding situation, or stress can be described as being how we might react when we feel under pressure, under those pressurized situations in life. And also another description that's often can be used is this idea that it can be either a bodily or a mental tension that might result from factors that tend to alter an existing equilibrium. And so the idea here with stress is it is something that makes us have to change in terms of what we're thinking perhaps, or maybe how our body is responding. Now, we can kind of break down stress further in terms of thinking about what we might refer to as stressors and the stress response. And so stressors are what we would consider being those physical or those psychological or even those social stimuli that might typically trigger a stress response from us. So thinking about this in really basic terms, if we're thinking about thousands and thousands of years ago, a stressor for a cave person, for example, could have been seeing that saber-toothed tiger. Now, in today's society, we don't experience saber-toothed tigers, but we might, for example, experience a job interview. If we're crossing the road and we haven't looked carefully, we might suddenly see a car coming quite quickly towards us. That would be a stressor. It is springing the body into action to have to cope in that situation. Exams can be stressors, but also we have social stimuli that can be stressors, such as, for example, walking into a room full of people we don't know and having to make small talk. That again could be a stressor that triggers a stress response to a particular individual. And the important thing when we think about stressors is that what might be stressful for one person might be different for another. So walking into that room and having to make small talk with people might be incredibly stressful for one person, but actually for somebody else, it could be really quite an exciting opportunity to go meet new people and talk about whatever it is you're wanting to talk about. So there isn't just key things that lead to stress, and that can very much vary between people. The stress response is then the coordinated physical, affective, and behavioral reactions that as an individual we would experience when we are exposed to that threat. And that threat can be perceived or it can be real. So it's very much a real threat to our well-being if we were to encounter a saber-toothed tiger. And the coordinated responses are then how would we respond in that situation? And you can see here for this individual, it is turning around and running away as fast as possible. That is the stress response they've experienced there. An important thing with this description of a stress response is that it's reactions to not just real stresses, but also those perceived threats as well. So walking into a room of people, we're probably not in any immediate danger, but we still get that stress response because we perceive it as being a threat to our well-being. And we can categorize these different responses broadly into being physical, affective, and behavioral responses to stress. And these lists aren't extensive. They're just to give you an example of some of the different responses we might experience when we're stressed. And again, this can vary between different people. So with our physical responses, I'm not going to read them all, but it can include things such as elevations in heart rates, that nauseous feeling we sometimes get when we feel stressed. It could be things like having a dry mouth. Some of you might feel like before you're about to do a job interview or maybe an exam, you might be sipping water a little bit more often because you get that dry mouth feeling, for example. Affective responses refer more to those feelings that we might get in terms of our emotions. Anxiety is often a key emotion people tend to experience when we feel stressed, but it doesn't have to necessarily be negative, like being overwhelmed and things. Sometimes people get more energized. They get psyched up under those situations when they feel a bit more stressed. Things like also being irritable or aggressive can be other tendencies that people might display when they're feeling stressed. And then in terms of our behavior responses, again, this isn't an extensive list, but just to give an idea, sometimes we might become more restless. Some people might become withdrawn. Stress can also alter our day-to-day habits. So perhaps some of us might eat more when we feel stressed, that sort of comfort eating, while other people might eat less. They almost have that nauseous feeling they don't want to eat food. It can affect our performance as well with stress. So it doesn't have to just be that head in hands negative effect. Sometimes when we feel stressed, it can actually make us a bit more productive. It might spring us into action to work that little bit harder. And we see that a lot with athletes when they're under pressure. Sometimes they might raise their game and perform just that bit better than they would in the absence of stress. And a very unhealthy behavioral outcome would be things like self-medicating to cope. So maybe things like alcohol misuse or drug engagement, that type of thing. In terms of the sources of stress, of what gets us in those stressful responses, these can be broadly categorized as being short-term exposures. And this is the idea that it's a very quick, acute stressor that leads to a response that might last for minutes or potentially hours that can be maybe more adaptive. So if we go back to this saber-toothed tiger example here, having that stress response is a really helpful thing. Being able to turn around, make that split-second decision, have that blood pumping to those muscles so that they can run that little bit faster to get away is a good thing for their survival. An individual who wouldn't get that stress response, that's an example of where it's not going to be helpful for them. They're the one that's going to be essentially eaten in that situation. Although we don't have saber-toothed tigers in today's society, thankfully, that same stress response might be the thing that gets you to jump out of the way of that car that's coming quite quickly. In an exam, it might be something that can help you remember that piece of information that little bit more or write that little bit more quickly. So stress can sometimes be adaptive if it is in that acute state. The issue that comes with stress tends to be this more long-term exposure to sort of chronic stressors or repeated acute stress exposure over days and years, because over time, that's what leads to more maladaptive responses. And this is the part where it's most problematic in terms of the stress exposure can be linked to poorer mental health. And
seems to be a slight pause in the webinar. We will be back in a second and just yes, are you able to continue on this part? Fab.
Yeah, I can. So I will take over from where Sarah left it. So what Sarah is saying is that you've got so she just described the shorter term kind of responses, but then on the longer term, stress can lead to poorer psychological health. So things like anxiety disorders, depression, burnout, and even post-traumatic stress disorder. So that is when we are following long-term exposure to chronic stresses. So one of the things to think about is kind of like, what is that impact on of stress? And whether we like it or not, everybody will be exposed to stress at some point during their life. So what we need to think about is, how can we then prevent, what can we do to make sure that that negative impact on psychological well-being is being prevented and people are feeling happier? So what is that red cross? What can we do to make sure that we cope with and manage our stress? So this is a bit that is taken from the NHS website about how to manage stress. And one of the things that is mentioned on here is being more physically active, and that's going to be the focus of the remainder of this webinar. So I'm now going to hand over to Laura, who will present some of the work that she did as part of her PhD. So over to you, Laura.
Sorry, having all of the technical difficulties today, but we will carry on. So as said, I'm just going to present one of the studies from my PhD, which, as you can see, was titled Examining the Associations Between Physical Activity, Self-Esteem, Perceived Stress and Internalising Symptoms Among Older Adolescents. So the aim of this particular paper was to look at how physical activity relates to stress, and then relate how that then relates to anxiety and depressive symptoms, but not through direct relationships, but through relationships with other traits and variables. So to do the study, I developed a model. So bear with me, it is a little bit in depth, a little bit complicated, but I'll try my best to explain it to you clearly. So to begin with, physical activity in the literature, as we've discussed, has been seen to be associated with lower stress. So in relation to that, the question is, but how? So research has also suggested that physical activity increases self-esteem, and self-esteem then feeds into resources. Now, resources are things, whether these are people, traits, just anything along those lines that you can draw on when you're under pressure in a stressful situation in order to help you cope. So on top of that, in addition to self-esteem feeds into those resources, and it can help to change how you appraise stress. So from one side of it, there is the challenge appraisals, which is how you see a stressful situation as an opportunity for growth, gain, or development. And if you have more of a challenge appraisal to a stressful situation, you are more likely to be able to cope with that stress. However, if you have more of a threat appraisal towards a stressful situation, you are treating that situation as harmful to you, and it's opportunity for loss rather than that development. So if you have more of a threat appraisal, then you are more likely to be stressed under that situation. The level of resources that you have, so whether that's those dispositional traits such as self-esteem, they can influence whether or not you go into a challenge or a threat appraisal. It is possible to have be sort of in a challenge and a threat appraisal. It's not mutually exclusive. There is overlap between the two. So, and again, it's very individual. So what one person may perceive as a challenge, another may perceive as a threat. So additionally, self-esteem has been seen to be linked to distress tolerance, which is literally how well you tolerate being in distress. So a higher distress tolerance means you cope better than if you have a lower distress tolerance. Now, combined, all of these different factors, say self-esteem, appraisals, and distress tolerance, are likely to influence perceived stress. So the suggestion is that physical activity will result in higher self-esteem, more adaptive stress appraisals, so a challenge appraisal as opposed to a threat appraisal, and higher distress tolerance, all of which combined will result in lower perceived stress. And then if you've got lower perceived stress, you are less likely to have anxiety or depression, as yet mentioned earlier. So to collect data for this particular study, data was collected from around just under 300 participants aged between 15 and 19. They all completed a questionnaire pack, including the scales that are seen on the screen just now. And we ran that through the model from the previous screen and checked how that data fit with the proposed model. So it was found to be a good fit, which suggests that those relationships that I've just suggested are accurate for that particular data set. So it was found that physical activity was in fact associated with lower perceived stress through increased self-esteem, those more adaptive stress appraisal, so a higher challenge appraisal and lower threat appraisal, and increased distress tolerance. It was also seen that lower perceived stress was associated with lower anxiety and depressive symptoms. What is interesting, though, is we also reran the model, adding in a direct link between physical activity and perceived stress. And what was found in this case was physical activity wasn't actually directly associated with perceived stress, either positively or negatively, which suggests that physical activity reduces stress. I say reduces loosely because this is correlational, not causational. But physical activity reduces stress, not directly, but through other personal traits such as self-esteem, appraisals, and distress tolerance. As I just briefly mentioned, the results are correlational only. So from this, we can't necessarily say that physical activity causes an increase in self-esteem, which causes an increase in challenge appraisal, but it does show that there are those associations. I am going to hand back over to Yet now, who is going to carry on with some interesting findings relating to physical activity and stress over time.
Yeah, thank you very much, Laura. So yeah, I will. So Laura just showed some really nice data where she did a very interesting study using some advanced statistical analysis to look at the links between stress and physical activity, and how she collected that data was asking the participant over the course of 1 week, what are your levels of stress typically, and what are your levels of physical activity, and then all those other outcomes as well. But when we look at those aspects, we really need to think about that, because stress, we know that it can vary between days. So one day you can experience a lot more stress than other days, and it can also vary within days. Now that is the same for physical activity as well. You can be, working like me, kind of like sitting here at a desk at the moment, but then in the evening you can do more physical activity, for example. So if we want to really understand these links between stress and physical activity, and perhaps that was the reason why we found in Laura's first study, where we might not have found that direct association between stress and physical activity. So we wanted to look at that in a little bit more detail. So what we wanted to see is using kind of like methods like ecological momentary assessment or diary studies. And what you do in those studies is you ask at regular intervals throughout the day, for several days, you ask people, what are you doing at the moment? How are you feeling? Do you do any kind of like have you done any physical activity, or are you doing any physical activity? So with that, it captures the fluctuations within a day of your levels of physical activity and stress, and also between days. You can then do within-person associations. So what you see here on these pictures that I kind of drew, which I think is clear. So at the top bit in the graph, you can see, this is fictional data, but you can see the levels of physical activity over the course of time. So time in this case is several time points throughout the day for several days. And you see those fluctuations, and in the bottom graph, you see the fluctuations in stress. And you can then see within a person, because you will have loads of data points for every participant, you can see whether physical activity is associated with stress at that time point. Now, another thing that you can look at is to see if does physical activity at one point, is that associated with physical activity at the next time point. So for example, you can see whether there are links between physical activity levels on day 1, whether they are associated with stress levels on day 2. So it's really kind of, and I won't go into the detail of all the statistical analysis, but it's a really interesting way of looking at this. So this is looking at the impact of physical activity, or the links between physical activity and stress. But you can also look at that in the other way around. So are your levels of stress associated with the levels of physical activity, either concurrently or over time? So this is looking at the between-person analysis, but you can also see with, again, sort of using those statistical analysis, whether there are any, whether the overall levels of physical activity, for example, have an impact. So here, what I've again sort of drawn here, hand drawn, which I think is again very clear. You see one participant on the left, who has high levels of physical activity overall, and you can then see what are those associations with stress. And the person on the right has lower overall levels of physical activity. So you can also see whether there are any of those between person characteristics that can drive the associations between physical activity and stress. Now, the example here is looking at the overall levels of physical activity, but you can also think about factors such as age that could drive it, or gender, or any kind of like other psychological variables that could potentially drive those associations. Now, what we did, and again, this was as part of Laura's PhD. She was very busy, so this was another paper that she published. What we wanted to see is, well, what is already known in this area of work. So we did a scoping review. So this was looking at all studies that had used either physical activity or measured sedentary behavior and had included an outcome related to stress. We found 33 papers even, and all papers had, and that's common with a review. They'd use different approaches to with regards to the number of times they took the assessments. There were some differences in the types of analysis that they had done, and also some differences with regards to how they had taken their measures. So what did we find? And the findings were mixed, which is sometimes not really nice, but at the same time, it gives us quite a lot of things to discuss, and also gives us some ideas for future research. So we found some studies did find indeed there's within-person associations between people being more physically active being associated with lower levels of stress. But that was not always the case. So taking all the data together, what we did say, kind of like, the data does suggest that there may be an association with where stress is associated with less physical activity a little bit later. And the reverse we found as well. So physical activity may be associated with less stress. But we're quite kind of careful with that statement. Because what we also looked at when we were thinking about that is the studies really varied with regards to how stress was quantified. So some people had just mentioned the number of stressful events, whereas others had much more looked at how does stress make you feel, for example. People hadn't really looked at different intensities of physical activity, and also the context at which physical activity could take place. So it was a very kind of like interesting findings to see what was known, but also gave us some opportunities to develop new ideas for new studies. And that's kind of what kept us going a little bit, because what is really going on, and how are those links between physical activity and stress? And Laura already showed in her first study, looking at all those different kind of like outcome measures, such as self-esteem, for example. And of course, when we think about it, just because you go for a run, that doesn't mean that you won't encounter stress. So should we, instead of looking at perceived stress, should we be looking at, does physical activity impact on how you feel that you can cope, or that you can manage stress? And that's what we did subsequently. So this is a study, again, where Sarah was involved, and this was with Ros Bainham, another PhD student, together with Katerina Rendero and Nikos Toumanis. So this is a very novel data in terms of we haven't published it yet, so it is currently under review. So I'll just give you a few of the highlights, I guess, of this study. So in this case, we had 59 healthy participants, and we had asked them on a daily basis for 7 days to report the levels of physical activity they had done on that day, and also including a measure of intensity. So we had light, moderate, or vigorous physical activity. We asked them also how stressed they had felt over the course of the day, but we also wanted to look at a little bit more about how well they felt they had coped with stress and how they felt on top of things. Now, we had a really good completion rate. So out of those participants, we got, depending on which outcome you look at, but almost kind of like 100% of data returned. So we had for most of our participants, we had 7 days of data. So we wanted to look at, again, kind of seeing like, okay, how is physical activity associated with coping and stress and feeling on top of things? And again, looking at that within person association. So if a person is more physically active, is that then associated with how that person feels, their stress levels, their coping levels, and their feeling on top of things? So what was interesting, and I guess in line with some of the studies from Laura's review as well, is that we didn't find this within a person association between physical activity and levels of stress. But what we did find was that physical activity was related to how people felt they were coping with stressful situations and how they felt on top of things. So kind of feeling on top of things, we kind of interpret that as how they were able to manage all the different tasks they were dealing with. And we found the reverse as well. So feeling on top of things was also associated with high levels of physical activity. So this was really interesting. So this shows that there might be some links, indeed, what we suggested also from the review from Laura, that it really, that link between physical activity could potentially influence how you cope and how you can manage stress. So taking a little bit of a step back and thinking a little bit more about kind of like underlying mechanisms and what could be driving this. So there is a lot of kind of research available about the links between physical activity and well-being. And a lot of work has been done on the physiological benefits. So we know that being physically active, it's good for your heart. It can reduce your weight, which has a lot of additional health benefits. It can make you stronger. It's good for your brain. It can have some anti-inflammatory effects as well. And in general, it can boost your immune system. So there's all these physiological benefits, but we also know that there are quite a lot of psychological benefits as well. We know that being physically active can help with feeling less depressed. It can help with managing anxiety levels, and it is also, as I already mentioned early on, it's also a way that the NHS recommends that you manage your stress levels. So what are those psychological drivers that could explain that? And there's a lot of different things that have been suggested and evidenced by research. So being physically active, that can give you a sense of achievement that you've managed to do your physical activity task, that you've managed to go for a walk, for example. It can also be a very good kind of like distraction. It can take you away from the things that are bothering you, the things that are stressing you. It could be a good way of detachment, and I have an example of that in a minute as well. But it can also, having those levels of physical activity throughout your day can give you some structure. Now, I just want to draw your attention to a study that was done, that was published last year, which really looked at the impact of context when you look at the links between physical activity and well-being. And I think this very much relates to stress as well. So at the top row here, you see 3 different pictures of people walking. So the physical activity they do is exactly the same. But what they found in this study was that how people said that being physically active could help them had really different kind of ways. So sometimes being physically active, going for a walk by yourself, it can really help you to think things through. And that could be, if you think about that with stress, that could be a really good way of managing your stress levels and thinking it all through and allowing yourself time to process it all. If you look at the right, there are 2 people going for a walk together. That could be another really good stress management way, where you can actually talk things through together, and you can say how you are feeling, but you can also get the feedback from a good friend, for example. So that could be another way of managing your stress levels. And then in the middle, there's three younger people having a nice walk and laughing and joking, and that could be a really nice way of distracting. So all these different pictures, they all do the same physical activity. They are all walking, but the context and of what they in which they are walking is different. But all of these different contexts can have a really good benefit for your well-being, and could be ways through which you can cope with your stress. There's also thinking about kind of like the physical context in which you are walking. So there's the person walking in the forest, so really kind of walking in nature. With Centre UB, we are actually taking our the first PhD cohort, we are taking to Coniston up in the lakes, and that's where we will talk a little bit more about the benefits of being in outdoor space and being physically active and well-being. But going for a walk like that is very different to the walk that people might do, kind of commuting into work in a city. So again, the space or the context of the walk is very different. I mentioned in a previous slide a way that physical activity can be really good as well in the terms of managing stress or coping with stress, is that sense of detachment. So in this paper, quite a few people described that they really enjoy, after a day work, to do some physical activity before they then are home and can relax. So they then use that physical activity as a break to, I guess, process everything that has happened during their work day, to then have kind of more relaxing time in the evening. So that is going for doing some activity later in the day. Other people said that actually being physically active in the morning, that gives them a lot of energy. So that is a good way, and that's how they can then feel that they can face all the stresses that they might experience over the course of the day. It can also just in general provide you some structure to in your day, which could be a good way to manage the stress levels as well. So that's quite a lot to say about these few pictures. But what I'm really trying to say here is that there's loads of different psychological ways by which physical activity can help you to cope and manage your stress levels. And we know stress is prevalent, so it's really important that we find ways that we can manage and cope with our stress. And physical activity is definitely a way to do that. Now, what is nice, and again, kind of referring back to my previous slide, there are so many different ways to be physically active. The examples I gave are walking. You can also go for a bike ride. You can go for a run. You can play sports. So many different kind of things, and they all have different physiological but also psychological benefits. So I think it's important, if you want to use physical activity to manage your stress levels and to support your well-being, try something that you enjoy, either by yourself or with a group of people, and that can really help your well-being. And I think that was it from me.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All. I think we're going to hand over to Alex now. Yeah, but thank you very much.
Yeah.
I'll finishing that off. Over to you, Alex.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Victoria. And thanks, Laura, Jet and Sarah for that webinar. That was really, really interesting. Definitely a big advocate myself of physical activity as a way to kind of manage my stress levels. So I'm Alex, research manager at ukactive. So I'm just going to describe a little bit about the partnership that we have currently with Centre UB. But firstly, for you that might not be aware, ukactive, we're the not-for-profit body that represents the fitness and leisure sector. And so by that, I mean that we exist as kind of the trade body to help support the health of the nation through getting more people more active more often, which is both our mission and our slogan. So we do that by providing a variety of services and facilitating partnerships across a really broad range of organisations that feed in and play and support that vision. So we serve around 4,000 members and partners that work across the public, private and third sectors. We also work with different multinational organisations and also kind of down to local level community groups. So anyone really who has a role to play in supporting individuals to be physically active. I sit within the Research Institute there, which serves as the research arm of ukactive, and we exist really to generate and translate physical activity based evidence into kind of real world impact, and sort of be that bridge between academia and our sector, as we call it. And we do that all to support, protect and inform our members, and that's all about making sure that our membership but also that wider physical activity sector can grow. We use research to underpin policy and delivery, and work quite closely with a number of government bodies to do that, and where we can kind of achieve that kind of sector and both academic impact. And we've had quite a long established relationship with the University of Birmingham and have worked on a number of previous and currently running projects that have been funded through the National Institute for Health Research and UK Research and Innovation. But obviously today I'm here to talk a little bit more about our partnership through Centre UB, which is really exciting. And we really see this as an opportunity to connect together the needs of kind of our sector with the expertise that's coming out of academia. And we're hoping through this partnership we can kind of forge those new connections between our members and our partners, people who are working on the ground to deliver physical activity interventions and programs in leisure facilities, for example, with kind of relevant other relevant industry partners and other individuals in academia, really to progress those areas of research that are going to have that kind of meaningful impact to the industry and to the end user. And we've kind of built the partnership to progress some key areas of interest, and with the Centre UB, and aligning with that pillar around equity in physical and mental well-being. And some of those involve kind of upskilling the fitness and leisure sector workforce to be able to support individuals with long-term health conditions, looking at interventions that might be suitable to run in leisure facilities that can also support conditions that can be managed by physical activity and therefore take some pressure off the current NHS, and looking at where we can address inequalities to access to those current physical activity opportunities. As we all know, the benefit that physical activity can provide, and we want that to be as accessible to everyone as possible. So we actually will be publishing this afternoon a joint blog between us and Centre UB, which will hopefully be hosted on both of our websites, and that should provide a little bit more information and detail on kind of the need for our partnership and what we hope to do moving forward. So I'll leave it at that, but it's a really exciting opportunity, and hopefully we'll be seeing more of each other. Not that I can see anyone except the panelists, but hopefully we'll be seeing more of each other going forward.
Thank you so much, Alex, and thank you to all of our panel members for a really insightful discussion, and a virtual round of applause for all of you in terms of deepening our insights into stress, physical activity, and also the organisations that work and have influence in the physical activity sector.